On the night of December 6, 1978, a night watchman named Pier Fortunato Zanfretta drove his Fiat 126 along the icy lanes above Torriglia. The road was empty, and the temperature had dropped hard enough to turn the recent snow into a sheet of glass. He was checking the villa called Casa Nostra for the Val Bisagno security company when the engine and headlights died without warning. He stepped out into the dark with his Smith & Wesson and a flashlight and saw 4 lights moving inside the garden. He radioed that he was going in to look for burglars, but the set stayed silent. He crossed the open gate and pressed himself against the outer wall. Something touched his shoulder from behind. He spun around with the pistol raised, and the beam of the torch lit a figure that stood 3 meters tall with gray, undulating skin and triangular yellow eyes. He dropped the flashlight, ran back to the car, and began shouting into the radio that they were not men. Later that same night, his colleagues found him beside the villa in shock, repeating that he had seen them. Carabinieri arrived within hours and measured a broad semicircular mark pressed into the grass behind the house. Over the following days, 52 local residents told officers they had watched a large triangular light move across the same stretch of sky. Those physical traces in the statements stayed on file even after the first shock had passed. The operator who took the panicked radio call remembered Zanfretta repeating the same short sentence over and over until the transmission cut off. The colleagues who reached the villa more than an hour later described a man who could not stop shaking and who kept pointing back toward the garden wall. They loaded him into another car and drove him down the mountain while he still muttered about the size of what he had seen. By the time the first Carabinieri patrol arrived, the ground trace was already cooling in the night air, but the mark remained clear enough to photograph and measure before dawn. Zanfretta worked the night shift for a private guard company that patrolled empty villas in the hills between Genoa and the Apennine passes. The winter routes ran along State Road 45, then turned onto narrower lanes that climbed through Marzano toward isolated houses left closed until spring. On the 6th of December, the sky was clear, but the pavement had frozen solid, and he drove the small Fiat slowly to keep control. The last lighted windows fell behind him after the village, and the only sound was the tires on ice. Casa Nostra stood at the end of a short drive at Dentist Summer Place with a low stone wall around the garden. Zanfretta had checked the same property many times before and knew the layout by heart. He parked on the verge just before the final bend, and the engine cut out at that moment along with every light on the dashboard. He had left the main road near Torriglia after finishing an earlier round, and the cold had already taken over the route. The small Fiat 126 was the kind of car that made sense on narrow mountain lanes, but once the last houses of Marzano fell behind him, there was not much between him and the dark except the road, the wall of the villa, and the radio link back to the control room. He had checked places like Casa Nostra before, so the job still felt like routine until the routine stopped answering him. The published account places him near Casa Nostra around 11:30 after he had taken the road from State Road 45 toward Marzano. The hills above Genoa were quiet in December, and many of the houses in that country were empty, shutters closed, gardens left to the frost. Zanfretta had done enough night rounds to know the difference between a normal suspicious light and something that needed a call to base. That night, he thought he was looking at burglars. He tried the ignition twice, then stepped onto the road with the revolver in one hand and the switched-off torch in the other. 4 moving lights showed clearly inside the garden hedge. He assumed thieves were already inside and keyed the radio microphone to report that he was entering the property. No answer came back from the control room. The gate stood open, and so did the front door of the villa. Zanfretta moved along the wall, keeping low until he reached the corner. The touch on his shoulder came without sound. He turned the torch on, and the beam rose to the height of a tall man's chest and kept rising. The figure stood directly in front of him, gray-skinned with yellow triangular eyes and a network of red veins across the scalp. He let the flashlight fall and ran. When he reached the car, the first words that made it through to the control room came out as panic. He tried to describe what he had seen, but the description broke apart into the same terrified phrase. Not men. The operator later remembered that the call cut off after Zanfretta repeated that the thing was not human. By then, the scene had already moved past a burglary call. A guard had entered a garden expecting thieves and had run back to the car, unable to explain what had touched him. The first colleagues who reached him did not find a caught intruder or a ransacked villa. They found Zanfretta shaken badly enough that the story had to be pulled from him in fragments. The garden gate and the open approach mattered because they fit the reason he had gone in at all. He had not been chasing a light for its own sake. He had been doing his job, crossing into a property he believed had been entered. He reached the car, still shouting into the microphone. The operator on duty later recalled the first clear words arriving just after midnight. Zanfretta kept repeating that the figure was not a man. While he spoke, a triangular mass of white light lifted from behind the villa, rose steeply, and vanished with a long hiss. The light was bright enough that he had to shield his eyes. He remained beside the car until colleagues arrived more than an hour later. They found him trembling and repeating the same short phrases about what he had seen. The first Carabinieri report noted the semicircular impression in the lawn and the statements of residents who had watched the light cross the sky at the same hour. The triangular light was described by Zanfretta as longer than the villa itself and bright enough to force him to shield his eyes. He said it rose from behind the house, carried smaller colored lights, and went into the sky with a hiss. That was the image that made the story impossible to keep inside the walls of Casa Nostra. A guard running from a figure in the garden, then a bright triangular object leaving from behind the same property. When the brigadier from Torriglia arrived, Zanfretta was still repeating the same words about the size and color of the figure. The officer took a brief statement on the spot before arranging for Zanfretta to be driven to a warmer location. The report filed that morning listed the time of the radio call, the description of the figure, and the location of the ground mark behind the villa. The mark behind the villa measured roughly 3 meters across and sank several centimeters into the turf. Officers described it as the sort of depression left by a heavy object settling on soft ground. 52 separate witnesses gave descriptions of a flat, luminous shape that changed from white to red as it moved. The station commander at Torriglia forwarded the statements and photographs to the Unified Prosecutor's Office in Genoa. The documents remained in the file even after the case was later archived for lack of criminal elements. The physical traces and the number of independent observers became the parts of the record that could not be explained away by a single man's account. The Carabinieri report, dated January 3, 1979, became important because it did not treat the whole night as a campfire rumor. It described an unidentified flying object and humanoids in the formal language of a report, then moved the material toward the Genoa court system. The 52 witnesses mattered for the same reason. They did not prove what Zanfretta saw in the garden, but they made the sky over Torriglia harder to dismiss as only one frightened man. The court file eventually reached a judge in Genoa and was archived in January 1980 for lack of criminal elements. That ending sounds dry until it is placed next to what had entered the file. A night watchman found in shock, a ground trace, a reported triangular object, witnesses, and a command report that did not reduce the event to a joke. Those papers later became the source trail that kept the case alive after the newspaper attention faded. The attention did not make Zanfretta's life easier. When the story reached the Ligurian press, he became a punchline almost overnight. People treated the night at Casa Nostra like a local absurdity, the kind of story a city repeats because it lets everyone feel smarter than the frightened man inside it. But the pressure on Zanfretta was not abstract. He was a married guard with 2 children, a firearm permit, and a job that depended on being taken seriously after midnight when other people were asleep. Inventing a giant gray figure in a garden would not have helped him. It would have put his work, his reputation, and his ordinary life at risk. That is the human detail the early coverage could not quite swallow. The report on the table was strange, but the man behind it did not look like someone gaining power from the attention. The first days after the incident gave him mockery, questions, and a local reputation he had not asked for. If he wanted a quiet shift again, he had chosen the worst possible story to tell. And still, when investigators and reporters pressed him, he kept returning to the same pieces: the dead car, the garden lights, the touch on the shoulder, the height of the figure, and the triangular light leaving the property. The reporter Rino Di Stefano later described his own first reaction as disbelief, then curiosity. He had covered the case as a young journalist and wrote that the question that kept pulling him back was not whether aliens were easy to believe. They were not. The question was why a respected night watchman would deliberately walk into ridicule and possible dismissal with a story that made him sound impossible. That question became the reason Di Stefano kept following the case for the next 2 years instead of letting the first newspaper cycle bury it. By then, the case had already split into 2 tracks. On one track were the claims that sounded unreal: towering visitors, a triangular craft, a man saying they were not human. On the other track were the pieces that could be filed and checked: the radio call, the coworkers who found him, the grass depression, the witness statements, the Carabinieri paperwork, the medical certificate. The horror of the Zanfretta case lives in the gap between those tracks. The official file could not make the creatures real, but it also could not make the night vanish. 11 days later, on the night of December 27, Zanfretta was again on patrol, this time in a Fiat 127. Radio contact broke at 23:46 when he reported thick fog and the car moving under its own power. 4 minutes later, his voice returned calm and steady. He said the vehicle had stopped, he could see a bright light, and he was getting out. Search teams left immediately, but rain and low clouds slowed them. The car was found on the mountain road leading toward Rossi. The first officer to reach him noted that Zanfretta's head and ears were unusually warm while his clothes stayed dry. The roof of the Fiat was hot to the touch. Beside the car lay several large footprints with concave soles more than 50 centimeters long. Zanfretta told the rescuers that voices had said they wanted to take him away and asked what would happen to his children. The search party moved through rain, fog, and mountain dark while the radio room waited for another message that did not come. When they reached the Fiat, the detail that stuck with the rescuers was the condition of the man, not a clean explanation for how he had gotten there. Zanfretta was crying, shaking, and afraid that someone or something still intended to take him. The fear had shifted from what he had seen to what he believed was coming back. The officer who examined the scene described the car roof as hot and the marks near the vehicle as huge concave footprints more than 50 centimeters long. Those details became part of the same official trail that had already started with Casa Nostra. Again, the careful way to say it is not that footprints prove aliens. The careful way to say it is that a second incident gave investigators physical details they felt were worth writing down. On December 23, a Genoa physician skilled in medical hypnosis placed Zanfretta under regression at the request of the reporter following the case. The recorded session showed Zanfretta describing a bright, warm interior where tall gray figures examined him and placed a device on his head. He spoke of beings he called Dargos who came from a place he understood as Titania. He said they wanted him to deliver a message and that they would return. A neurological certificate issued a month later by a hospital specialist stated that Zanfretta showed no alteration of thought, no perceptual disturbance, and remained fully capable of logical judgment. The doctor concluded he was fit for his ordinary duties without restriction. The hypnosis therefore added detail that matched the earlier physical traces but remained the product of one man's recovered memory. The session was recorded, and the account that came out under hypnosis pushed the story beyond a frightening patrol call. Zanfretta described heat, light, a device near his head, and figures that wanted him to go with them. He said he had been taken somewhere, questioned, and brought back. That material is not the same kind of evidence as a ground trace or a witness statement, but it explains why the case stopped being only a sighting and became an abduction story. The neurologist who examined Zanfretta after the second incident wrote that his thought processes and sensory perception appeared normal and that he remained fit for work. That certificate did not make the abduction true. What it did was remove the easiest dismissal. The man at the center of the story was not officially written off as unable to think clearly, and the security company had to deal with a guard who was frightened but still considered capable of doing the job. The hypnosis also changed how people listened to him. A simple sighting could be mocked and then forgotten, but the recorded sessions pulled the story into a deeper and stranger place. Under regression, Zanfretta was not giving a polished speech. He was describing fragments as if he had been dropped into them again. Heat, light, a device, figures he did not want near him, and a pressure to understand them before he was ready. The accounts included language and names that made the whole thing sound even less believable, but they also gave the case a structure. The first night became the door. The second disappearance became the proof that the door had not closed. That structure mattered because it gave every later incident a terrible expectation. Once Zanfretta believed the visitors had said they would return, a stalled car or lost radio signal was no longer just a bad night on patrol. It became the beginning of the same thing again. His co-workers were no longer only checking properties, they were listening for the moment his voice changed on the radio. The company still had to run its routes, but the hills above Genoa had turned into a map of places where one guard might disappear and come back with a story nobody wanted to carry. Public attention kept widening the wound. Zanfretta appeared on Italian television and the case became nationally known, but fame did not solve the fear. It made the fear repeat in front of strangers. A man who had once driven quiet lanes with a flashlight and a pistol was now being asked to explain, again and again, why he had panicked in the garden and what he remembered after the missing time. The more people watched, the less private the terror became. On July 30, 1979, Zanfretta disappeared again while on motorcycle patrol near Quarto. He was located 2 hours later on the summit of Monte Fasce. The only road to the peak had been under observation and no one reported seeing him pass. Under a later session conducted with sodium pentothal, he described being lifted by a green light and taken aboard a craft. On the night of December 2, 1979, while driving a Mini near Torriglia, 4 other guards lost contact with him. They saw 2 bright lights descend from a stationary cloud and their own vehicle stalled. One lieutenant fired his service pistol toward the lights before they withdrew. The following day, an ANSA bulletin from Guadalajara, Spain, described a Spanish veterinarian whose car had been followed and briefly illuminated by a similar yellow glowing object on the same calendar night. The timing was noted but treated as a geographic coincidence rather than proof of connection. The Monte Fasce episode made the pattern harder to contain because it moved him far from where he was supposed to be. The road access was being watched, and still he was found on the summit after more than 2 hours missing. The later pentothal session was meant to answer the obvious question: how did he get there? Under that drugged interview, he repeated the core of the abduction account and added the green light. On the December night near Torriglia, 4 guards became witnesses to the search, instead of just co-workers hearing a story afterward. They saw lights from a stationary cloud while they looked for him, and Lieutenant Giovanni Casiba fired his pistol toward them. The next morning's ANSA item from Spain added a strange echo from far away, but it stays an echo, not a link. The important fact for the Zanfretta file was closer. Other guards had now been pulled into the phenomenon around him. After that night, the case was no longer only Zanfretta against disbelief. Other uniformed men had been on the road watching lights descend while a company vehicle stalled beneath them. One of them had fired because, in that moment, the thing overhead felt close enough to shoot at. A skeptic can still reject the alien explanation, and should be allowed to, but the December incident forced a harder question. What were trained guards seeing in the same terrain, around the same man, with the same failure of ordinary machinery? The geography tightened around the story too. Casa Nostra, Rossi, Monte Fasce, Torriglia, the roads near Marzano, the route over the Scafera Pass. The names kept returning like points on a pattern. Nothing in the record proves that the pattern came from visitors, but it does show that the same small region absorbed repeated calls, searches, sightings, and reports. The case did not drift across Italy as a vague rumor. It stayed in one cold pocket of Liguria where co-workers, police, witnesses, and reporters could keep driving back to the places named in the statements. That is why the later sessions with sodium pentothal became so controversial. The drug interview was supposed to apply pressure to the story, to see if the account broke under a different kind of questioning. Instead, Zanfretta repeated the abduction framework. Supporters treated that as another point in his favor. Skeptics treated it as another example of suggestion and belief feeding itself. Both readings can live in the file, but neither erases the practical problem. The man had been missing, he had been found somewhere difficult to explain, and the story he gave after that discovery remained pointed in the same impossible direction. In later years, Zanfretta spoke of being given custody of a sphere that contained a luminous pyramid. He said the object was meant to serve as a record of the visitor's knowledge and that he had hidden it in the hills. No one else ever examined or photographed the sphere. During a 1992 visit to a ufology conference in Arizona, 2 individuals approached the reporter who had covered the original case and offered to buy the sphere for a film project they claimed would involve Hollywood financing. The negotiations collapsed over contract terms and the sphere remained unseen. Zanfretta eventually left the security company for warehouse work, then returned to night patrol but asked that the subject be dropped. He told interviewers he wanted only to be left alone with his family. The sphere story stayed the weakest and strangest part of the whole chain because no one ever produced the object for examination. That is exactly where the script has to keep its footing. The sphere belongs in the story because Zanfretta and Di Stefano both carried it forward and because Di Stefano later described the Arizona approach around it. It does not belong on screen as proof. It is the final, almost mythic layer of a case that already had enough documented weirdness without it. After the suspension of his firearms permit, Zanfretta spent several months doing daytime warehouse work before requesting to return to the night routes. He told the company director that he preferred the quiet of the hills and that he no longer wished to discuss the earlier incidents with anyone outside his immediate family. The Arizona story around the sphere is almost too strange to use, which is exactly why it has to be handled carefully. Di Stefano described being approached at a hotel in Tucson by 2 people who said they considered Zanfretta's account credible and wanted access to the hidden object. According to his account, they later came to Liguria, talked for days about contracts, film rights, and a possible Hollywood project, then sent paperwork through a lawyer in Chicago. The deal collapsed because the proposed arrangement left Di Stefano exposed to decisions he did not control. After that, the people disappeared from the story and the sphere stayed hidden, unseen and untested. That failed deal added one more layer of pressure to a man who already wanted the subject to stop following him. Di Stefano wrote that Zanfretta was disappointed, possibly because he had imagined the American project as a way out of the local joke his life had become. The image is rougher than the UFO materials. A guard who once said he had been taken by beings from somewhere else, then years later watching a possible film deal dissolve over paperwork and money. Even the unbelievable part of the case dragged him back into ordinary disappointments. The real ending is not a reveal, it is a withdrawal. The sightings faded from the Genoa province around 1980, and Zanfretta's official encounters ended the same way they had started, without a clean explanation anyone could hold. He kept saying privately that he had been given the sphere, but the object never entered public evidence. He returned to regular work, changed jobs, came back to patrol, and repeatedly asked to be left alone. Whatever happened in the hills, the afterlife of the case belonged to him more than to the investigators. The Carabinieri reports the court filings and the medical certificates remain in the Genoa archives along with the photographs of the ground traces. 52 named witnesses gave statements about the first night's lights, and subsequent patrols produced additional observers when Zanfretta was reported missing. The geography of the incident stays fixed between Torriglia Marzano and the roads over the Scafura Pass. The repetition across 4 separate nights, the consistent physical marks, and the unchanged neurological assessment of the man involved are the elements that continue to mark the file. The record shows a night watchman who encountered something he could not explain, left measurable traces behind, and carried the weight of those nights for the rest of his working life. The final court archive note from January 1980 states only that no criminal elements were present and the file was closed without further action. That leaves the case in a strange middle ground, too documented to ignore, too bizarre to accept cleanly, and too human to turn into a simple monster story. Zanfretta himself continued trying to live around the account, returning to ordinary work and asking people to stop dragging him back to the night at Casa Nostra. So the honest telling ends with the paper and the road. The paper says a guard made a panicked call, other people found him, officers recorded traces, witnesses described lights, doctors examined him, and a court later found no crime to prosecute. The road says something simpler. A man drove into the hills above Torriglia for an ordinary night check and came back with a fear that never quite left him. Every wild claim in the case has to pass through that plain fact first, before the Dargos, before the Sphere, before the television appearances and the American film talk. There was a frozen road, a dead Fiat, an open gate, and a voice on the radio saying they were not men.